And it gives me particular pleasure to introduce James Balog, class of '74 of Boston College. It's always a pleasure to meet one of BC's alums who have made such a mark in their profession. James graduated with an official major in communication, also studying biology, but his real passion was geology and the study of nature. He later obtained a master's degree in geology from the University of Colorado at Boulder. His love for photography really grew from wanting to capture his experiences on the mountains. He's an avid mountain climber and explorer. He bridges the artificial separation between art and science. His works over the last more than 2 decades have broken new ground in photography. His provocative and powerful images have been published in National Geographic Adventure and repeatedly in numerous other magazines, including the very current New Yorker magazine. The issue features a photo of melting ice cap on Iceland, but also Smithsonian, Audubon, Outside, Stern, Perry Match, and he is the author of 6 books that have been considered major conceptual advances in nature photography. He has received international acclaim and numerous awards. His book, Survivors, A New Vision of Endangered Wildlife, was considered a major conceptual breakthrough in natural photography. And for it, he received the Leica Medal of Excellence. His other books include Animal, 1999, Anima, 1993, Wildlife Requiem, 1984, I sense a theme, and the children's book, James Balog's Animals A to Z. His newest book, of course, is Tree, A New Vision of the American Forest. James's photographs have been exhibited in major art institutions from Greece, Paris, to New York, and Los Angeles. They're in dozens of collections, including those of the Corcoran Gallery and the International Center of Photography in New York. Regularly published in the world's major photo magazines, he won first prize in Graphis Magazine's annual competition and has twice received the top honors from World Press Photo. He's worked on the series A Day in the Life of America and A Day in the Life of the Soviet Union, and was the first photographer ever commissioned to create a series of stamps for the US Postal Service. So we are very, very excited to have him here, and with you, I look forward to hearing his insights about how he developed as an artist, his photographs, his experiences in the natural environment, and how he sees the union of art and science in his work. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you. So, hello, Jim.
Hello there.
I thought we'd start at the very beginning and ask Jim a little bit about his background and what influences in his childhood. We'll take a, not quite a Freudian approach to this, but we'll ask him how he got interested in his career.
Yeah. Well, the question, I suppose, goes a long way back, and you know, essentially, this is coming out of a lifelong interest in nature. You know, it's nature had me hooked when I was little, and I didn't really quite understand how the roots went back all the way through until I was much older. I couldn't see it at the time. Certainly, when I was a student at BC, I couldn't see it. But in any event, I just spent a lot of time as a child wandering around in forests, and I remember being about 7 years old with these little things that I thought were cross-country skis and going out after a snowstorm and wandering around trying to bash through knee-deep snow in the woods and thinking that was all pretty fantastic and wonderful. My parents took me on quite a few camping trips. You know, I lived in New Jersey. It was not exactly a wilderness area. But there was a lot of open forested lands near our house, and so we went camping in those forests. And my parents took us camping all over New England, and I have very fond memories of the wood smoke and the smell and feel of the forests, and of hiking up peaks and looking out over landscapes, and that really fused itself to my psyche in a way that has really sustained me all these years. You know, I'm 52 years old. That was more than, I mean, some of those earliest memories are 45, 46, 47 years ago. So these things, incredibly enough, propagated out through all of these years and decades, and were really literally the roots of what I've done.
And you bring to your photography, aside from an interest in nature, an unusual interest in how you photograph nature. And you bring a considerable understanding of probably the history of photography and science and rocks and roots from an educated background. And how did your experience at BC contribute to that?
Yeah, I can't say that I was, that the path necessarily showed itself from the BC years. I now look back and I see that there was a very clear pathway, but at the time I could not have predicted I was headed for photography. I came here thinking I was going to be a history major, for lack of a better idea. And I was interested, I mean, I love history still. I'm not dissing history. I think history is a marvelous discipline. And in fact, I was just reading a Civil War history book at bedtime last night. But I was very interested in radio. I was a DJ on the campus radio station. I used to love to sit and just play great progressive rock of the time. And but then my sophomore year, I became a speech communications major. I think that was the very first year there was that department here. And I did that my sophomore and junior years, and also got a degree in secondary ed along with it. But as I was finishing my junior year, I realized, you know, I don't really want to go and spend half of my senior year doing student teaching. It just didn't appeal to me. And I thought, I've got one more year left in college, and I've always been fascinated with geology. So why don't I just spend my senior year studying geology? So I canceled the student teaching idea, and I took 14 courses in geology that last year, which is a very, very heavy load. It was brutal. I hadn't taken math since my junior year in high school, and suddenly I was taking calculus my senior year in college, and then geology courses ranging from freshman level to senior level simultaneously. But yet I just loved the science. I was really fascinated with it because to me it spoke to questions about what was making this earth under our feet. You know, it's not, to me it's a very, very living science. It's almost like biology. It's the story told over a longer period of time of the life of the earth underneath our feet. So I was really fascinated with it and was happy to throw myself into that. And so I came away with a very strong minor in geology also by the end of my college career, and then wound up going to graduate school at the University of Colorado in Boulder to study geomorphology, the study of landforms. I went to CU because they had an organization called the Institute of Arctic and Alpine Research, and I wanted to study mountains. Mountains were all I thought about because I got into mountain climbing when I was 18, and I spent all my free weekends here at BC hitchhiking up to New Hampshire so I could go climbing up there. And so it was mountains, mountains, mountains. And that's what led me really, spiraling back around here, it was the mountain interest, the climbing interest, that really made the geology come alive, and it was the geology that led me to CU. And so there was that underpinning in those sciences.
I mean, how did you get to photography? When did you discover that as a passionate?
Yeah, I was at CU. It was the second year of my master's work, and I had the bizarre good fortune of having an incredible thesis topic. I had been looking around for a thesis topic when this huge flash flood came down a canyon called the Big Thompson River in 1976, and unfortunately, nearly 150 people were killed in this flood. It just happened. This 20-foot high wall of water came pouring down this canyon and wiped out all these houses and cars and so on. And it was literally during the weeks when I was trying to figure out, okay, what's my thesis going to be? And suddenly it was like, duh, here's a thesis topic. We'll study the Big Thompson Canyon. And so it was great. I did this wonderful field work, and I actually discovered some things that nobody had known about floods before. But late in that process of finishing the thesis on the flood, I realized, this is all about statistics and computer modeling. That's where my thesis advisors were driving me. And at the time, computer modeling was a really exotic, arcane piece of science. We didn't have desktops and laptops. I mean, computers were these big, horrible, ugly, scary things standing in corners. And I remember very clearly sitting there under the fluorescent lights one night, handling a stack of data punch cards, thinking, I'm not meant to be a statistical modeler and a modern scientist. Modern science is going to statistics and modeling. That ain't me. And what I need to be doing is exploring this interest in nature through the only other thing I really like doing a lot, and that's photography. So it was right then and there, as I was working on that thesis, I figured, okay, I'll get the thesis done, but I'm going elsewhere. And I'm going to set my course on photography. I had already been shooting as a serious amateur for 6 or 7 years at that point. I had actually taken a couple filmmaking courses here at BC. They were the earliest filmmaking courses as well. And so I had a little bit of formal grounding in it, but not very much. But I really liked doing pictures. I always had a camera with me when I went up to Mount Washington or Franconia Notch or whatever and went climbing. And so it was sort of a natural outgrowth of everything else.
So were your early inspirations photographers like Ansel Adams and Edward Weston, and is that the sort of wellspring of your
definitely.
original aesthetic?
I would say it was probably closer to a National Geographic kind of aesthetic. I didn't really become educated about Ansel's work and Weston's work, the whole Weston family's work, until I had already made this decision to move in that direction. What I aspired to was this idea of going out and wandering the world and experiencing things and coming back and telling stories about them to a readership. I mean, the only really clear role model I had was National Geographic. I didn't know that there was an Ansel Adams out there in California doing fine art pictures for the wall and doing it for museums. So it was really more National Geographic style work that I was focused on.
And how did you get your foot in the door as a storyteller for magazines? Did you assist other photographers, or did you come up with an idea and sell it to a magazine?
It was insane. The beginning was insane. I really, looking back on it now, I don't understand how it worked or why it worked or anything. It's so improbable because it's a difficult business to break into. Very, very hard now. It was a bit easier back then because there were more opportunities in the marketplace, but still it was hard. And I had this idea that, I sort of vaguely sensed that there must be a normal career ladder where you work your way from a small town newspaper to a mid-city newspaper to a large city newspaper, and then you start working for national magazines, and eventually after working for enough national magazines, then maybe you wind up at National Geographic. And I was brash enough and foolish enough to just think, okay, I'm going to maybe make a new game here. I'm going to skip all those intermediate steps. I don't want to work for a small city newspaper. And so what I did was I figured I'll photograph what I know about, which is climbing mountains and earth science. So, I had these skills as a mountaineer. I could go and climb Mount McKinley. I could go to Mount Everest. I could go ice climbing, rock climbing, could run whitewater rivers and feel happy about it and still function and make pictures. So I figured, okay, I'll photograph those things. And my really very first published picture was a picture of ice climbing in Rocky Mountain National Park. It was actually of a guy who's since become famous, John Krakauer, who wrote Into Thin Air, the story about Everest. Krakauer and I used to climb a lot in the 70s. And so I did these ice climbing stories, and then right around that same time there was a lot of interest in earth science topics. This is now late 70s. There was a lot of concern about alternative energy, and so I did stories on oil shale development and geothermal energy supply, and then Mount St. Helens erupted, and suddenly, because I had this geology background, I was a guy that they could turn to, the editors could turn to and say, hey, well, I don't know how it's really going to affect his pictures, but he knows about things like volcanoes erupting. Let's give him that story. So I had a whole bunch of Mount St. Helens stories all of a sudden in the spring of 1980.
Did you also write the text that went with the stories?
Yeah, early in my career, I was writing all the time. I was shooting these stories and writing. And in fact, this is interesting. I hadn't thought about this. It should have been obvious, but it just occurred to me from that question. I was one of the editors of my high school newspaper. I wrote the sports page for about 3 years. And so that gave me a platform of writing to spring from. I didn't do much writing except for school papers during college. I wasn't on the newspaper or anything. But when I started down this path with the photography career, I thought, well, you know, I don't have much of a portfolio as a photographer, but I can write. So with the smaller magazines, if I could supply the writing and the pictures, it gave me a doubly good chance to get the stuff published and get paid for it. So I was doing both those first 2 or 3 years. And during that period, I published several long features in Outside, in Smithsonian. There was a magazine called Geo at the time, a very beautiful magazine that is still published in Europe, but has gone out of business here some years ago. But they had a fantastic run for about 4 or 5 years in the United States. I did an oil shale story for Geo. But once I had developed enough of a picture portfolio and editors at some of the major magazines like Time and Smithsonian were seeing my pictures, they're going, we don't take you seriously if you're doing both media. You can't be a writer and be a photographer. We don't take you seriously as a specialist. So what are you? Decide. I said, well, I started down the path of photography. Seems like a nice romantic lifestyle. Down that road. And so which was good in a way because it forced me to specialize and get stronger in that medium. But over the years, I realized, you know, this isn't so good. I lost part of my voice. Mm-hmm. You know, the voice had an expression through the eyes, and it had an expression through the mind and the words. And the mind and the words never had any chance to come out except when I did my own book projects. I never published anything else with my words until the past 3 or 4 years. And by 1998, I had thought that was an artificial dichotomy. I should be able to do the words also, and damn it, I'm going to start writing again for publication, and I have been.
For magazine publication,
Yeah.
you're doing your writing. I know that one of the big problems that photographers face is that often the photographs that they consider their best don't get published because of editorial decisions that the photographer has no control over.
Yes.
How do you live with that?
Yeah,
those issues, how do you
fantastic.
make peace with that?
There is no peace. Is your mic on?
It should.
Okay, good. Yeah, I wasn't sure. Okay. There's a constant push-pull between the original creators of pictures or words and the editors that are the gatekeepers that stand between you and the publication. And it's a love-hate relationship for sure, and sometimes it's not so kind as that. But I can't tell you. I was thinking about it as I drove here today. That I hope to never hear an editor say to me again, ever, "Boy, that was a hell of a good picture, but we can't use it." And you hear that so many times because in narrative magazine work, the pictures have to exist in a fairly narrow box. You know, they have to tell a story. They have to tell a story in a very simple, clean way, simple to the point, frequently of oversimplification. And I realized fairly early on that a lot of my best pictures were not going to get published because of this issue, that they weren't narrative enough. They may be very artful, they may be very creative, they may be an expression of light and composition and all the things that would make them worth putting on a museum wall, but they didn't narrate a storyline very well in a journalistic context. And it got aggravating. And the other realization quite early on was that this was by, I've been shooting seriously, steadily, continuously for maybe 3 or 4 years. I realized that the best work I was capable of doing was not going to be assigned by a magazine in advance, and it quite likely would never be published by a magazine. That in fact I needed to create my own, what I call personal projects. Many photographers call them personal projects. I had to create my own personal projects and pursue them in order to dig as deep and as hard into some of the more difficult subject matter as I wanted to. And that's where all my books came from. Not a single one of these books was because a book publisher or an editor said, here, you know, take this $50,000 and go shoot for a year. That never happens. Never happens. It's always because you have your own internal drive, and you can't live with yourself unless you pursue this thing that you've got in your head, and it's just pushing you to get out there and work.
Well, that leads to another question. Are a lot of your are you assigned work, or do you come up with an idea and suggest it to a magazine, or do you go ahead and pursue an idea, make the pictures, and then know who a potential outlet might be for that work?
Well, again, it depends on the nature of the body of work and the idea. In the beginning, in this phase before the books started, before I started working on the books, it was always that I had an idea for a story, and it always has to be a story. It has to be something that you can tell in 3,000 to 5,000 words, in 3 to 8 pages. Back in the ancient days, 20 years ago, it was quite common to get an 8 or a 10-page spread in a magazine, and we could think in those terms. Today, you're lucky if you get a 3-page spread, except for National Geographic. There's very few spreads any larger than that. But in any case, back then, you could think in terms of, say, an 8-page picture story. And so you would have to conceive of this story, you write a proposal, you send the proposal to an editor, you hope the editor is awake that day and that week when it lands on that person's desk, and you hope that there hasn't been already another proposal about the same topic sitting on his desk. Essentially, you act as a free research service to the magazines. That's the freelance life. You're a free, unpaid research service. You put a lot of your own time into it. Nobody will ever pay you for that. And then you offer up these ideas. And I've since come to realize that very frequently they poach your research ideas, give it to somebody else. And I didn't know that at the time. There was a lot I didn't know. Innocence is great, and brashness is great. You don't know how big the obstacles are when you're young. And you just go out there and you keep tilting against the windmills, and sooner or later you get a score, you know, and it works.
And you affiliate with other photographers, and you kind of share information about how different magazines work. And you didn't work for as an assistant for anyone. You really
no, I never
launched
assisted.
your career.
No, I went straight from these outdoor interests into publishing first individual pictures and then picture stories. The first paid assignment I ever had was a story for Smithsonian Magazine. It was a 10-page story on avalanche control in the big ski areas in Utah at Snowbird and Alta. And I got that story because actually this was weird. I had this assignment writing a story on oil shale development for Geo. That took me to Washington, D.C. I talked my way into an interview with the Smithsonian editor, and I walked in there and he said, "Oh, so you're here for an oil shale story. Well, do you have any good ideas for us?" And I thought, "Oh, is that what I'm supposed to do here?" I had no idea. And I just blurted out, "Well, how about a story on avalanche control?" Because I had just been on a climbing trip with a guy who was involved with avalanche control. And the editor looked at me and he said, "Avalanche control, what's that?" And I described what they did with throwing explosives into the catchment zones of the avalanches and how they tried to set them off before the avalanches got too big. And the editor, who was the science editor, a guy named Jack Wiley, said, "Geez, I've heard about a lot of things, but I never heard about avalanche control before. That's a great idea. Write up that proposal for us, and I think I can sell that." Next thing I knew, I had an assignment. And they paid me. It was amazing. It was like miraculous.
And it's been fun ever since.
Yeah.
Your approach to photographing nature is unusual, your fine art work. I mean, to that extent, to the extent that you're doing fine artwork now, and you didn't start out with that as your
Yes.
primary interest, you've developed a style that involves the tools of a commercial photographer. Sometimes the apparatus that you use in your photographs is visible. You're not hiding your hand. You've got nylon cloth, and your lights are visible. And how did you come to that kind of decision, or how does that
Yeah.
work for you?
Well, you know, in the beginning, that first project, Wildlife Requiem, was something done in a literal, realistic documentary fashion. I went out and I looked at people killing big game animals in the Rockies, and I photographed that just with an on-camera strobe and a 35 millimeter camera. And I let it go at that. I worked on that for 2 years, did a book, did an exhibition, and that was that. But I kept thinking, there's much more I can do with animals as a symbolic form. Animals express a lot more than I was able to do in Requiem. They express a lot more than I was able to do in traditional wildlife photojournalism. And yet I didn't know what that more would be. You know, it was just kind of sitting out there for about 2 or 3 years as this idea in my head. I kept thinking, there's more, there's more, there's more. What will it be? And one day I was shooting a National Geographic piece on endangered animals. And I was close to a rhinoceros, literally this closer. It was like this. And we sat there staring at each other for about 20 minutes one afternoon under the sunset. And with this huge wall of rhino flesh next to me, you know, my whole field of vision was just this rhinoceros, this amazing texture, and he's sitting there with his little eye rolling around studying me. And it was like a lightning bolt hitting me. And I thought, you know, there's so much power and personality and character and intelligence and individuality in these entities like these animals. And the trick is to alter the context in which you see them. It doesn't work if you're 100 yards away shooting through a 600 millimeter lens this long. You're not getting the right visceral contact with the animal. You have to be in there shooting with a wide angle or a normal lens, and you have to alter the surrounding, and you possibly have to alter the lighting so that you do something different than literal nature photography. And that's where everything else started. It was that rhinoceros. And it was
Subsequently, you photographed endangered wildlife that were in captivity.
Yes.
These were exotic animals that were on the verge of extinction, that were
in captivity,
owned by private individuals or zoos, or
correct. Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that. And
Yeah, and that
what
sprang.
that was like. What it was like looking
Yeah.
at these animals in such close proximity.
It was fantastic. You know, I had done, up until that point, I had done half a dozen years of running around Alaska and the Arctic and Africa doing conventional wildlife photography. And as I say, you're always looking at them from far away through what amounts to a telescope. And then when I did survivors, it was, no, I don't want to photograph that way. We're going to be close. And so suddenly I'm in small rooms doing portraits of orangutans and grizzly bears and gorillas and pandas. And you're seeing the animals in a way you never ever do in the wild. You're appreciating them as sculptural forms in a way you can't when your field of vision when your field of vision includes all the natural objects like rocks and sky and trees and grass and so on. If you put them against these backgrounds, like pretend this background is white, that's what I was doing. We would be in a room like this, sometimes on a little stage with a white background here, and there'd be a gorilla. And I'm sitting there photographing this gorilla. When you see the gorilla against that surface, you see him sculpturally far differently than you do when he's out on the leaves. And you also get an intense appreciation for how he's thinking about you, his personality and his character. There's a tremendous intelligence that lies on the other side of this glass wall that separates humans and nature. There's fantastic thought processes going on. And you have to look into their eyes and you have to see their reactions and be with them in order to appreciate that. And that's what those studio settings gave me. I mean, originally I could only understand the personality and the intelligence when I was looking at mammals, because I'm a mammal, we're all mammals, and you have an appreciation for the mammalian psyche that you don't have for a bird or a reptile. But over time, I came to appreciate that even like a python or an anaconda, big snakes, sitting on these white backgrounds, that they were doing their own process of judgment and study and analyzing. They had their own moods and their own personalities. And there was things that they wanted to do or not do. And again, you never would appreciate that if you were out in the wild.
So what preconception most changed in dealing with these animals? I mean, you photographed panthers and orangutans who are notoriously vicious and aggressive. How did you?
Well, I think the biggest realization was, for me, it shattered what I came to understand was about 400 years worth of Cartesian thinking. The French philosopher Descartes had imprinted Western philosophy with the idea that animals were these mute bundles of instinct, and they weren't. They were everything but that. They may not have language the way we do, they may not have the level of intelligence we do, but they shared a lot of our psyches.
Now we're going to make a quick trip to the new body of work, the trees.
Sure.
And let's talk for a moment about the connection between the trees and the animals, and then...
Yeah, the tree work, strangely enough, comes directly out of the animal work. The animal process opened up a way for me to look at individual animals as individual personalities, do portraits of them as singular characters, and not look at them as just undifferentiated members of a species. That's the way the human race always looks at them. They're just gorilla, or they're gazelles. There's no individual gazelles, there's just gazelles. But they're different. So I was still working on animal things, and I saw a newspaper clipping on trees and about people who looked for the largest trees of various species in the United States, these trees called champion trees. And I kept that newspaper clipping around in my studio for half a dozen years. I wasn't ready to work on trees yet, but I kept it with me thinking, not interested in the people looking for the trees, but these trees themselves could be a very, very interesting subject to look at. And one day in 1998, I decided to start working on trees. And that took nearly 6 years, I guess, to get that series photographed and published. And that's the work that's in the McMullen Museum right now.
One last question that I'm begging to, just dying to ask you, and how do you respond to people who refer to you as a tree-hugging liberal?
I am a tree-hugging liberal and proud of it. I'm a bunny hugger too, actually. And yeah, I think there's a lot that we as a species don't understand. We've been very myopic and self-reflective. I think, in fact, a lot of photography reflects our species' perceptual limitations. John Zarkowski of the Museum of Modern Art wrote a very influential book called Mirrors and Windows. It was an exhibition about 25 years ago. And he talks about how photography can be a window into the worlds beyond us, and how it can also be a mirror that reflects back to us what we are and what we think about. And I think in terms of nature photography, an awful lot of that work tends to be, I'm sorry, not nature photography. I think a lot of photography tends to be a mirror, not a window. We're stuck inside this hall of mirrors too much of the time. And so I'm happy to use photography as a vehicle to break the mirror, look through it to the other side, and see new things. If that has a political dimension to it, and perhaps a culturally critical dimension, I'm happy for that. I think we live in some very difficult times intellectually in this country uniquely right now. And if the work can somehow make some contribution towards altering behavior or altering political direction, I mean, that's a tall order. It's difficult to shape these things and to move a big juggernaut of a culture that's rolling in one direction. It's hard to move it in a new direction. But if it can make some contribution towards that, I think it's been worth my effort. And I hope it can do that.
Do we have any questions that the audience would like to ask at this point?
You spoke about, I guess, your relationship one-on-one with the personality of the animal when you were photographing the animals. I guess I'm curious about how, when you're dealing with a tree and with its inanimate personality, if you could just expand upon how that's different.
Yeah, that's a terrific observation. Let me answer that with a little story. I was out in the redwoods of Northern California one time. I worked in these huge redwood forests for many months in the course of shooting that series. And it made me anxious for a while, you know, because there's a lot of trees. There's a few really super large trees, but there's a lot of choices in how you photograph it, how you rig the ropes, how you pass through the forest, how you hang the lights in the backgrounds and where you put yourself and so on. And I was wandering through this forest one day trying to make all these decisions. And this guy who was with me, Steve Sillett, is a redwood biologist. He is, in fact, the biologist who knows redwoods better than anybody else in the world. Strange, arcane subdiscipline of the universe, but it's a very worthy and beautiful thing. He understands redwood trees. And I was saying to Steve, geez, I don't know if we should go here or go there or whatever. And he said, he's a California guy, and he speaks in this sort of California surfer talk all the time. And he said, dude, don't worry about it. Doesn't matter. Because the redwoods are going to tell us what to do. We're just here doing their bidding. You know? We don't have a choice. Just be quiet. They'll tell us what to do. And that was a good point of education for me, because I relaxed and let go from there on out, because I realized he was articulating something I had been sensing for several years, that these trees had a very powerful presence. They didn't speak to you through eyes the way mammals and birds do. They couldn't speak to you through their voices the way people do. But the trick was to slow down, to be patient, to stop, to have a whole different mindset when you approach them. And it was amazing how easily the pictures came. I was shocked by that, completely unexpected, because so much of the time in all the photography before that, there was often a feeling of, oh, we have to work for this. You know, it's like, oh, you get up in the morning and you go, oh man, what are we going to do next? This will be hard, and where's the picture coming from? I don't know how to do this. Would somebody, you know, I look in the mirror sometimes when I'm brushing my teeth and go, would somebody tell me how to do this? You know, I don't know what I'm doing next. But with the trees, you just get out there, and if you just kind of throw away your preconceptions, try and look at what the world is giving you, try and look at what the tree is giving you, it was amazing how often the pictures worked. And that for me ties in beautifully to what I have found through all the other photography as well. If you go out there with this preconception about, well, I want this, you know, I have to have that. And that's sort of a journalistic mindset. You have a story script, you have to shoot this and this and this picture in order to tell a story. But when you're trying to work in the place of art, expression, a real deep visceral connection, you have to get rid of all of those preconceptions. You just have to be there. You have to get rid of your rational mind. You have to stop thinking that you're thinking clearly and you just have to respond and react and look at light and look at the action and be with all of those things instead of in some sort of weird picture you might have in your head. And I've almost always found that the world gives you something spontaneously that's much better than anything you could have ever imagined. You know, maybe what you imagined is the place where you start the picture session for the day, but with any luck at all, that's only the starting point, and you just sort of keep rolling along, and magical things happen after that. And it's the magic you're looking for all the time. One other sub-point here. In many art forms, particularly painting and sculpture, people are very conscious of what are called happy accidents. And I think that's a very, very powerful thing that happens. In older times, those accidents were called the muses. The Greeks referred to them as the muses. It's like these little guardian angels that are fluttering over us, bringing creativity into the world. And those forces exist somewhere, somehow. And the happy accidents are those muses in action. It's a painter who's working on a canvas, and he thinks he's going to use that blue, and he just, damn it, can't make that blue work. But it's a different blue, and the blue is going elsewhere. And then a drip happens, and then another drip happens, and one thing leads to the next, and before the painter knows it, it's turned into a different painting. Or a sculptor is carving marble, and a crack happens, and you go, oh, well, okay, let's make a new sculpture that deals with the presence of that crack in a new shape. You have to go with those things. And the problem with photography is it's an art form connected to a machine. So you think, oh, okay, I'm supposed to have this technological machine-like control over the creative process? Not at all. You really are out there just kind of following the cracks in the world and letting them lead you to where you're supposed to be. Very long answer to a simple question, but I hope that got there.
There's someone else who'd like to ask a question. Oh, and you'll be next.
Come on up.
Please.
Um,
Yes, please.
I'm interested in your recent work with trees, in that how you choose to present them. You don't just have one single photograph. You sort of do this jigsaw arrangement with several photographs.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you were inspired by another artist, or if it's simply just because the subject matter is, really it's very large and difficult to capture in one
Yeah.
photograph.
Yeah, that work came out as a response to the scale of the subject matter. When I started working on trees, because I had this background with the portraits of the animals, I thought in terms of the trees being portraits that would have these artificial backgrounds and these big complicated lighting setups. Well, I did that for about 2 years, and eventually wound up having this backgrounds made that was, I don't know, twice the size of the floor plan of this room. I mean, it was a huge piece of fabric, and we had to have cranes to winch it up in the air. And it very rapidly became clear that the engineering was impossible, on these bigger trees. I was sort of scaling up in the size of the trees, and I was finding ways to put this fabric up, but I was perfectly well aware that I had not dealt yet with redwoods and sequoias, the biggest organisms in the world, and that the background idea was going to be a non-starter. I'd never get those things off the ground. I couldn't put a 400-foot tall background behind a redwood tree. And you actually could. I've devised ways to do it, but you need a big budget. You need a big rigging crew, and you need $100,000 to shoot one of those trees, and that doesn't happen in the world of still photography. So anyway, I thought, all right, well, I need some other trick, need some other way of looking at the trees. What I was very clear on is that I did not want to go to the bottom of a redwood and look up at a tapering column of wood going into the sky, or look sideways at some beautiful blossoms on a bush next to the base of the tree. We had seen millions of those kinds of pictures already in traditional nature photography. And that's always been my mantra, that in these books, I don't want to do what we've already seen. I want to find new things. I want to break the mold, push the envelope, go further. So I really, in terms of the redwoods, I didn't know what I would do. But I called this guy, Steve Sillett, who I found on the internet, and introduced myself, and I sent him copies of my books, and he said, come on out and I'll show you around the redwoods. Well, it turned out that he knew how to climb these trees. There's like Steve and about 5 other guys in the world know how to climb these huge trees. And he taught me how to do that. And once we got up in the tops of these trees, like 30, 35 stories tall, I realized, maybe there's some way to be photographing the trees from different perspectives as you move down them. And that's really what led to the picture that's on the poster for the museum, that sequoia shot, where I'm rappelling down through the forest, shooting the tree in single frames and in sections as I'm moving down. Now, so it was really a response to an aesthetic experience and to an engineering problem. Does that mean that I was not influenced by everything else I had been looking at for the past, 50 years of my life? No. I had certainly been aware that Picasso and Braque thought about moving around objects and looking at them from multiple perspectives. I was aware, of course, of Hockney's composites back in the 80s. But I was most inspired when I was in that phase of the tree project. Somebody handed me this book called Full Moon. That's this beautiful album of pictures that NASA did on the surface of the moon before astronauts got there and after astronauts got there. And they would land these spacecraft, and the robots would sit there, and the camera would look up and go click, 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 and then look down and go click, 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 look down again, click, click, click. And there's these magnificent composites that were the first time human eyes have sat on the moon and looked at that world. And that's what really got me going. I realized, what I'm looking at as I'm rappelling through these forests, the human eye has never seen before. I didn't even see these things until I had gotten back. I had made all my exposures and I composited them together on the computer, and I could see the tree intact. I didn't see the tree intact when I was out there. I saw it in these pieces that were right in front of me, and I'm moving. So it was that sort of exploratory process that I really identified with, that there was this new world, and I got to explore this new world through the photography. And I thought it was a magnificent and wonderful experience. One final point. Digital photography is frequently talked about as just an alternative recording surface to film. And that process of working in the trees convinced me that it isn't. It's much more than that. That digital photography, if it's used right, is a way to move the perspective, just the way a cinematographer puts a camera on a dolly or puts a camera on a jib arm and moves the camera in space and looks at something from multiple perspectives. You see that so often in film and TV, you don't even know you're looking at it anymore. The mind doesn't notice that it's a multiple perspective, but it is. And you could always do that with still photography in film before, but it was impractical because it was too expensive to render it to handle all these multiple frames and put them together. Digital photography makes that multiple perspective very easy. And I think that I don't know what's next and what could be done with multiple perspectives in digital photography, but I think it's out there. And it's up to you guys to figure it out.
So there's someone with another question.
Please.
That was your
Okay.
question.
Yes.
I want to ask a question for the students. Can you say a little bit about what your life is like as a photographer and what you find is some of the rewarding aspects of life as a photographer and some of the challenges?
Yeah, good. Okay. I have gotten everything I wanted by being a photographer. Yeah. I've also gotten a lot of things that I didn't know were out there, and I didn't want them and didn't need them, and I got those too. My father was a Wall Street banker, essentially, and I watched him go into the office every day with a white collar on and a suit and a tie, and boy, from the time I was a little kid, it was like, I don't want to be like that, And I love him dearly, and he'll be here tomorrow night for the lecture and so on, but I didn't want his lifestyle. Because I was interested in nature, I wanted to be outdoors. That's all I thought about. You know, I want to be outdoors. When you grow up in a normal environment in America today, there aren't very many role models for how you can be outdoors and be a grown-up, you know, and make a living. You can be a farmer, you can be a lumberjack, you can be a miner, and believe me, those are tough jobs. And actually being a farmer, farmers don't spend much time dealing with nature in the outdoors. Their main job is being a machinery operator or repairman. That's what modern farming is all about. So, you know, I just thought I'd like to be outdoors. And then as I got older and I started climbing, it was, I want to go a lot of cool places and have adventures. You know, that's still the Tom Sawyer in you, you know? You don't ever want to grow up and settle down and have a desk job. You want to have adventures. And I got to do all that. I mean, I've been so many places. It boggles my mind, really. It's been an amazing life. This year I've been as Jeffrey mentioned, I was in Iceland photographing melting glaciers for this climate change story. I went to the west coast of Sumatra and photographed the tsunami damage in January. I've been, not this year, but I've been to the Himalaya, 5, 6 times. I've been to Alaska and the Arctic probably 15 times. I've been to Europe many dozens of times. Been to Africa many, many times, and you know, just everywhere in the United States. Everywhere that's worth going in the United States, I've been there, and I've probably been there half a dozen times. So it's really cool, the things you get to see. There's diversity, there's adventure, there's interest, and photography is this amazing opportunity to combine physicality with intellect. And there's very, very few things that let you do that. Athletes get to be physical, but a lot of what they do isn't particularly intellectual. And intellectuals get to be intellectual and have, you know, jobs as attorneys or government figures or whatever, but they don't get to be very physical. I get to do both, on a good day anyway. But then there's other days where I'm a businessman. You know, when all is said and done, I'm running a business. And that part, frankly, drives me absolutely crazy. I'm so tired of the business of photography. There were earlier times in my life when I really enjoyed the sort of the deal making and the, you know, figuring out of all the pieces on the chessboard and how to move along with these various problems with editors and the film lab and the clients and the accountants and the lawyers and whatever. But now I'm just burned out on that. You know, there's a lot of just trafficking of materials that go on. You know, Bob knows it from the gallery. A lot of what you have to do in a gallery business, just as in being a photographer, it's just inventory management. It's stuff coming in and going out, you know, just being handled. And hell, I could do that selling shoes. You know, I could do it selling tires or something, do it where you might actually make some really good money. I don't know if tire guys make any money, but you know, it's just all about business process, and I'm very, very, very tired of that right now. The other thing is that you know, I have had a good excuse to have a great lifestyle and see these great things and get paid for it much of the time, most of the time, almost all the time. But it's not an easy way to make a living. It honestly isn't. And it's become progressively more difficult over the past 10 years, particularly the past, well, 4 or 5 years. You know, the recession drove the photo business down. Post 9/11 drove the photo business down. It's created changes from which the business will never recover, and the business has assumed some new forms that are progressively less advantageous to photographers. One of the biggest ones is the presence of stock agencies, these big libraries, of which I'm associated with one, and a big part of my income comes from one of those. But there are these big inventories of photography. And an awful lot of photographic needs on this planet are now supplied by buying cheap pictures from archives instead of hiring guys to go out and do them. That's a huge problem, and it's making it very hard for young guys to survive. Fortunately, I own the rights to all of my pictures after 25 years, and I can earn royalties on that. But somebody else paid for most of those production costs. But if a guy starting out now can't get an assignment so you can get out and put the pictures in the archive, then you're really in trouble. And then secondly, the big multinational communications companies, Time Warner, National Geographic, Condé Nast, Bertelsmann, Sony, all these guys, they don't want you to own your pictures anymore. They want to own the content, and you turn into what the internet age calls a content provider. And you're just a guy supplying schmata, tchotchkes, you know, into the big commercial maw. And that's hard. They've been trying to steal rights to pictures, and many contracts you're forced to sign now have taken away a lot of ownership rights that we used to take for granted, and it's only going to get worse. So those are the downsides. But I'm not complaining. I've had a great life, great adventures. It's not always a bed of roses, but it's really been fun.
Are there any other questions? Yes, please.
I wonder
Oh, sorry.
if you could comment, will your trip to Banda Aceh result in a book, or is that
Yeah,
an assignment?
the Banda Aceh was strictly self-induced. It was not an assignment. I was going over in the third week of January when the tsunami was no longer a news story anyway. You know, the roving news eye in the world has an attention span of typically days to, at most, a couple weeks. You know, Banda Aceh was a big story for about 2.5 weeks, and then it died. I mean, there still are stories, like there was a story in the Wall Street Journal yesterday about tsunami rebuilding, but those are word stories. But the picture stories died by the middle of January, and I couldn't go in the first part of January. So I figured, all right, do I need to go for my own personal interest? Is this worth going all that way and taking whatever risks are attached to this for no assignment? And I questioned my sanity and doubted my judgment up until about 48 hours before I left. And that was like well, that was 3.5 weeks worth of anxiety. You know, from the morning of the tsunami, I was thinking, I have to be there, I have to be there, I have to be there. There's no place else I'd rather be. And then rationality set in, and it was like, you idiot, why are you going? It'll cost all that expensive plane ticket, all the time in Singapore, waiting at the hotel, you know, that eats money. You know, $250, $300 a day to sit in Singapore while you're waiting for plane changes and so on. And at the time, in late December, nobody knew if you could get into Banda Aceh. And so I tried to get, I got hooked up with the Air Force, the American Air Force, and I arranged to fly from here across the Pacific. I was going to go to Hawaii and Guam and then to Thailand and fly down from Thailand on an aid flight. And, you know, like dozens and dozens of phone calls and emails to put that whole thing together. And as I got closer to it, it wasn't clear exactly when the Air Force was going to say, okay, go be on this plane coming out of Illinois on this day. And I'm thinking, I can't live with this. I don't like the uncertainty. You know, there's enough uncertainty in this game without waiting for the airplane to get figured out. So I just decided one day, damn it, I'll buy the plane ticket, and I'll figure out how to get in there. So eventually, this is a long story that could go on. It could be an hour on this story. But anyway, I got there via commercial flights, and I'll tell you what, it was one of the weirdest experiences of my life was getting off that airplane on the runway, because as you're coming in, you're looking down, and the airport is still in the rice paddies in the jungle area, inland from where the tsunami hit. But most of the airport was covered with all the aid workers, all these tents, and you could see all these piles of supplies, and it was just pandemonium out there, just hundreds of people running around doing things. And when I left the States, I figured that I had to be totally self-sufficient, that I had to be prepared to sleep on my own, to feed myself, to have a water supply, because I had no way of knowing what was going to happen if there was a place to sleep or feed myself or have any food. So I couldn't, with the camera gear, I didn't feel like I wanted to carry enough food to eat properly for 10 days. But I took like starvation rations, like what we would take on a climb, where you're stuck in a tent on the south cull of Everest in a storm, and the food supply is running down. You go on like half rations or 1/3 rations, and I took that much. I figured I'll survive on this amount of food if that's what it comes to, if there's no other food in Banda Aceh because the place is wiped out. And I had a water purification thing, and I had a little sleeping bag, and North Face gave me this little mosquito tent, because the big thing in that part of the world is you do not want to get bitten by mosquitoes because they carry malaria and dengue fever and a bunch of encephalitises and some really nasty stuff that'll either kill you or ruin you for the rest of your life. And so I had to be protected in my little bug tent. So I went over there with this backpack full of stuff, and I got off the plane, and there's this little tiny baggage carousel, like, you know, this big, and the stuff was coming out, and there's all these really sweaty Indonesian guys and a few Caucasian guys standing there, it's like 98 degrees, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 100% humidity, unbelievably crushing heat. And I'm looking around thinking, oh my God, when I pick up that bag and walk out that door, what's coming next? I don't know what happens, you know? I knew I was going into a place where 100,000 people were dead, right there. There were 100,000 corpses out there on the other side of that jungle. And there were about another 100,000 missing. And I had no idea what I was going to do. And this guy standing next to me said, well, do you know what you're doing next? I must have had a look on my face. And I said, no, I don't have a clue. He said, well, you know what? I used to live down the coastline. My house was wiped out and all of my friends were killed, but I can help you. And it turned out that he was a surfer, an Australian surfer, and I had seen him on CNN about 3 days after the wave hit. And he was talking about seeing the wave come in. His name was David Line. And long story short, he kind of put me on this little track, this pathway that led me to a Muslim family that took me in. They lived in the non-devastated zone, and I had to pay them, but they were absolutely wonderful. They were the sweetest people. It's actually, it's a really, really hard experience still to talk about and write about. I just got done writing a piece for American Photo about this, and it'll be in, I think it's supposed to be in the July issue, but it was such an overwhelming experience, both positive and negative. The intensity of the highs and the darkness of the lows were so extreme, not like anything else I've ever experienced. And it's really, it's tough to come back into the memory sometimes. But the people were really, really kind. They gave me food, they gave me a place to sleep. They kicked the teenage boy out of his room. I took his little cot, and the mama made me 3 meals a day, and I fell in with another American photographer who was working there for World Picture News, Paul Taggart, and he and I sort of worked together, and well, we didn't work together, but we saw each other at night and traded stories and notes about what to do and where to go. But I spent all day out in the devastated areas. I mean, and you cannot imagine how severe the devastation is. I mean, I've been to a lot of third world places before, and I had an impression that, okay, you hear about all of the devastation, it's probably little fishing shacks on stilts, you know, Philippine style. But in fact, it was big, substantial masonry buildings. These were real buildings, like the houses were houses that would have been mansions in Palm Beach or Santa Barbara. This was some serious architecture, beautiful places. And these things were cut off like somebody came with a chainsaw around the foundation and just sliced them off and took them away. And there was nothing left except the concrete floor slab. And these houses that were 3-story houses with red tile roofs and concrete walls this thick were reduced to chunks of rubble that would fit in a trash can. And there were bodies everywhere. You learn to differentiate between the smell of just general debris that was soaked with ocean water and mud and the smell of debris that had a corpse in it. There was a distinctive odor. There was one whole day where I hardly ever shot anything. I was helping just dig bodies out of the debris and put them in body bags and bury them in mass graves. So it was, you know, there was the darkness was in seeing what the end of the world would look like. And that's what I was very conscious of at the time. That, you know, Rome, there was a fall of Rome. There was a fall of the Egyptian civilization. There's always a fall of civilization X or Y or Z. There is an end point to it. And as I'm walking around in that, I thought, well, okay, this is as close as I'll ever get to knowing what the end of this civilization will look like. And it's heavy, it's really, really heavy to see that. But I felt very, very blessed to have had a chance to look that far into history and that far into geologic time. And, as a geologist, you're always aware that so many big things that you see in the record of the Earth, they happened sometime way in the past. They're like so far back and the events were so removed. It's very hard to develop, to put your hands in it and really feel it. But I was there on this one. This wasn't, some ancient volcanic eruption that you can only see in the sediment records. This was something that was very, very live and immediate and real. It was an event that was, of geologic time happening right now. And that was amazing to get a chance to see that. And when I had to leave on that last day, I woke up in the morning and some of the most intense experiences of the whole trip happened in those last 4 hours. But I woke up in the morning and I thought, God, I don't want to leave this place. But man, am I glad I don't ever have to be here again. Because the people were so, the survivors were so wonderful, so amazing to be with, that you didn't want to leave. And the intensity of the experience with all of that death and all of that destruction was also so intense. I didn't want to leave that. At the same time, it was like, whew, thank goodness.
Well, I think we've come to the end of our time with Jim. I want to thank you very much.
Sorry I rambled on the tsunami so much. I could do a whole slideshow on that.
For those of you who have questions that didn't get covered during the time period, you can address them to Jim personally. Is that all right?